And we're going to share the screen. Okay. So here we are. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, this evening. We're going to talk about Wyoming Valley epidemics. My name is Mark Riccetti Jr. I'm the Director of Operations and Special Events. The other lady you see in one of your little bubbles is Allyson Earl. She's our Museum Manager. And basically, this is going to be it's going to be really, it's an overview. We're just going to scratch the surface of a lot of these because, I mean, any one of the ones we've talked about tonight, we could talk about for over an hour easily for every one of them. Literal books have been written about some of them, and nobody wants that. So this is just going to scratch the surface, go over a few of them, and we figured we'd get right into it with this photo, which we're cheating a little bit. This actually isn't the Wyoming Valley. You've probably seen it floating around. It's from Toronto, and it's from the 1918 influenza pandemic. The Toronto Sun recently reprinted it only about a week or two ago because, masks are back in the news. Mask wearing is back in the news. And that's going to be sort of the overarching theme you're going to see today. It's very cliche. History repeats. It's very cliche. Everything old is new again. But man, when we were going through and we were researching some of this, it's amazing the parallels that you find. Absolutely. If I can just change the slide, we'll be in business here. There we are. Okay, so we'll let you in a little bit behind the curtain. We'll break kayfabe a little bit here. Originally, the plan was we were going to do a program at the Swetland Homestead on epidemics for our Christmas program, for our festive traditions. Some of you may have gone to it before, where we go through the house and we do a tour, and we have living history reenactors. This year we were going to try to do holidays during an epidemic, and because you see so many times on TV and in the newspaper and on social media, people are saying, oh, this is just such an unprecedented holiday. And it isn't. It just simply isn't. People have done it before and they've gotten through it. So Amanda Fontanova, our librarian, actually said, oh, well, I have something you might want to use. And she came down with this. This is both sides of a postcard from 1911. And it's a little hard to read, but basically a Mrs. B, no last name provided, was writing to Miss Lydia Evans. And in the text of it, she said, I'm sorry I didn't come over to visit you for Christmas, and I'm probably not going to come over for New Year's, but one of our kids has scarlet fever. And scarlet fever was one of the many, many, many diseases that would just keep outbreaking over the course of the 19th and 20th century here in the Wyoming Valley. And so, even here 109 years ago, they were dealing with an outbreak, a fairly widespread one for scarlet fever. And, she's just saying, hey, we can't come. The kids are sick. I don't want to get you sick. We need to basically stay away and modify our holiday plans, which is what most of us are doing today. So here's a few other ones that we're not really going to talk about tonight, but I feel like we should bring up. As I said, disease waves were so common throughout the 1800s and the early 1900s. This area had it all. It had poor sanitation. It had terrible sewage and drainage, overcrowding, just poor people hygiene. I mean, we've seen the photos of coal miners coming home covered in coal dust. The way garbage disposal was at the time. Germ theory wasn't widely accepted. Even if you go into the early 20th century, if you look into the story of Typhoid Mary, which is very interesting now when we're talking about carriers and asymptomatic people, they interviewed her and they asked her about washing her hands. She said, I don't wash my hands. I don't believe in any of that germ stuff. And this was even 40, 50 years before that. So you had all of this, and this led to just recurring outbreaks of all sorts of diseases. Scarlet fever, which we talked about already, 1850, 1900, 1911, which is the outbreak that the postcard references, 1919. The measles, we had 1887, was particularly wild. In Shenandoah, they actually reported at one time there was over 500 children with the measles at once, just in Shenandoah. 1935, 1977, when I was looking at this, there was an outbreak in Scranton. There's photos of nurses in schools just vaccinating children frantically, giving them, shots, making sure everybody was up to date because there was an outbreak of measles in Scranton in 1977, which nobody could believe. Typhoid fever, which we're going to talk about, 1885, 1889, 1892, 1905. So you can see there's not a lot of big gaps between these. Smallpox, pretty much every winter at the turn of the century, 1901, 1902, 1903, 1931. Meningitis in 39 and 41. Of course, the big one is influenza, which we'll talk about later on, 1918. Diphtheria, 1944. Here's an article from the Wilkes-Barre Record, just a little blurb. And these were very common throughout, especially the 19th century. They would list everyone that was sick that day, well, the day before, and what they had and where they lived. So, you could stay away from these houses, 35 East Jackson, 30, another one, 35 East Jackson, 61 South Mead. Stay away from all those people because they're sick and this is what they have, and don't go anywhere near them. And this column would be pretty much every day, or at the very least every week. So, there was no HIPAA back then in the 1800s. Now, as we move on to the first one, typhoid fever, just, in case anyone was like me and didn't really know the symptoms, we'll start with that. It's caused by bacteria. A strain of salmonella, actually, is what does it. And you get all sorts of just wonderful, fun symptoms: fever, weakness, severe abdominal pain, throbbing headaches, incredible constipation, vomiting that can often include blood. You get a blotchy rash on your chest, in your collarbone area, in your neck. That's just awful. In the absolute worst cases, it attacks your nervous system and you get mental confusion and disorientation, and you're really out of it. And much like COVID, again, this is history repeating itself. It could take 6 to 30 days. We know with COVID, you can show symptoms in 2 days, 3 days, could take 15. With typhoid fever, it could take 30 days before you show any symptoms, or you could be completely asymptomatic. Typhoid Mary, she was a carrier. We already talked about her. She was completely asymptomatic, and that was something that locally was a wild concept that they had to learn. This article here is from the May 22nd, 85 record of the Times, which is a local paper, and basically they summoned to Plymouth the Luzerne County Medical Society, who they used to actually just be down the street here from us at the Historical Society. They were a collection of the greatest medical minds and doctors, surgeons, pharmacists, and they all gathered in Plymouth to go over what they thought caused it and to try to trace back and figure out, where patient zero was and why. And of course, it eventually came out that it was sewage in drinking water. There was a little mountain stream, creek, that residents were drinking out of. Raw sewage was being pumped into it, and poor sanitation is the #1 cause of typhoid. So it began in the spring of 1885, centered in Plymouth, lasted throughout the summer into July, early mid-August is about when it trailed off. It spread to the surrounding areas: Shikshini, Swearsville, Larksville, that whole southern tier of the west side. Now, the numbers are widely conflicting. Tell me if you've heard this one before. Oftentimes in the same sources of media, you would have wildly different numbers. Best we could tell, it was at least 1,100. It probably was a lot more than that, but it was at least 1,100. May 20th, the borough themselves, Plymouth Borough themselves, reported 905 as of May 20th, and we know it lasted about 2 months more than that. So was there only 100 cases each month? I doubt it. And there was just under 150 reported deaths. I believe it was 148 is the official number, but again, that is highly, highly contested. We already said it was traced to sewage in the stream. Now, this is interesting. The Wilkes-Barre Record estimated that it was going to cost more than $25,000 in 1885, which is $720,189 today. I love the inflation calculator. It's the best thing you have going. But that was just for Plymouth Borough alone. That wasn't counting all the other outbreaks. That was just the cost for Plymouth Borough. And what was that cost? Well, a lot of that was handouts. They were distributing food. They were distributing monetary donations to people that were sick or out of work, couldn't support their families, on a limited scale, but it was occurring. Cleaning up the water supply, getting a new reservoir, getting a new way to bring water into the people. Shutting down the city. Now, this one is, it's not a shutdown the way we think of it today, where everything's closed and you can't go out. No. If you look in the almanacs, they would just sort of close Plymouth. If you were there, okay, you were there, whatever, but you couldn't really go in or out, but people were still getting in and out, and that's why it was spreading. But at different times, they would have the town closed. You'd read in the almanac, you know, Plymouth is barricaded for how long? And then they would lift it, and then they would close it, and then they would lift it. It wasn't anywhere near the lockdowns that we have today or some of the ones that we're going to talk about a little bit later for other outbreaks. This article is interesting because this is an editorial in defense of the Plymouth Borough Council. Of course, in 1885, you didn't have social media, so it probably was a lot better time than it is now, just on that reason alone. But nevertheless, you had the newspapers, and you were constantly getting these articles back and forth, just absolutely eviscerating the Plymouth Council that they weren't doing enough and that it should be a wider shutdown and that there should be more help for the poor and more help for individuals that are out of a job. Or that, you know, you have people that are saying, you know, they were the cause of it, and if we had better sanitary work and better DPW work, we wouldn't have this. Well, this column is basically saying, you know, look, they didn't do it, they didn't cause it. At one point, they actually just say, we all know Plymouth is a very dirty town. Do you want to pay more taxes to clean it up? No, they're doing what they can to fix it. You know, just back off the council. And this was June 5th, so you still had about another month yet before that one wrapped up. This is what I was talking about in regards to the numbers and just wild different numbers. This is the Wilkes-Barre Evening News, which was the night paper from May 21st. And here on this part on the left-hand side, they are calling out-of-town papers, saying that, you know, they're reporting 730 cases, and now they're saying, oh no, it's actually less than that. It's actually only 716 cases. When in actuality, as of the 5th already, there was 841 cases. So basically what they're saying is, don't listen to the out-of-town papers. They're downplaying it. They're trying to make it sound like it's not as bad as it is, or, you know, it's not a hoax. This is real. These are the numbers. Stop me if you've heard any of this before. So then we go to 1889. This again was typhoid fever, but this one was in Wilkes-Barre primarily, and it went across the river a little bit, Kingston, 44, also went up to Laurel Run, Plains, but for the most part, it was in Wilkes-Barre. It was in the fall of 1889, fourth quarter 1889, and there was at least 700 confirmed cases and about 60 deaths. And for this one, there isn't as much argument about the numbers as there is about the cause. It's incredibly highly disputed, but it's believed that it was contamination in the Laurel Run Reservoir. Now, interestingly enough, a lot of the dispute came from sources funded by and promoted by the Laurel Run water people. They didn't want all the bad press of having a contaminated reservoir cause sickness. So you can see here, September 30th, 1889, they're already saying, you know, there's other things besides possible water here that could have caused it. I understand this is very hard to read on your screen, and I apologize, but I think it's important, this article, because this is just a very small piece of a full-page article in the Wilkes-Barre Evening News on October 2nd. And they play with, oops, I went too far, ignore that. They play with a few ideas here that show advanced thinking. Now, again, you have to take all this with a grain of salt because the water company is behind most of this. They're pushing these theories, but these theories aren't the worst. I mean, they're kind of modern thinking. Here we get the first talk of asymptomatic patients. Of course, they don't call it that. They call it walking typhoid. If you're not showing symptoms, but you're still going around and still spreading it to people, you have the walking typhoid, something that they didn't even acknowledge in 1885, really. You also have here, I thought this was interesting, they're trying to trace people who drank the water from the reservoir specifically. And they're saying, well, you know, why did people in this neighborhood only get sick and this neighborhood didn't, and they're all in the same reservoir and this and that. And they decided that Kingston, people from Kingston didn't really get sick aside from a few cases because they drink something much stronger than water when they're in town. So they're throwing a little shade. They're throwing a little shade at Kingston there. The center column here is interesting because it plays with the idea of germs coming back in ice, being frozen in ice. This, of course, was the time frame of the Iceman. You had an ice box in your house. They would come and deliver it, keep your food fresh. And a lot of the ice came from Bear Creek. there was a big outbreak around Bear Creek, and then 4 months later, it sort of died down, and 4 months later, it sort of flared up again. So they're asking, couldn't it be in the ice? Couldn't it be in the water in Bear Creek? And then you take it home, the ice melts, you get sick in your house. It's actually very plausible. And then on the right-hand side here, they have an article just railing against the sewer system in Wilkes-Barre. And this is interesting because this has not changed, basically 140 years later. They talk about how the rainwater and the sewers and everything merge together downtown. And in some places downtown, the sewers go right out into the river. And, you know, isn't that quite bad to be around open sewage? And that's what caused it in Plymouth. And why aren't we just doing it again? And it's funny because it's still the same way. If you've ever been downtown after a really bad rainstorm, walk around the square and all you can smell is sewage, because all the basins are the same, even to this day. So even though there is a substantial amount of evidence that it started in the reservoir, even though their intentions weren't the best, the water company did make a few interesting points here as to the outbreak and why aren't we looking at other things besides the reservoir. So now we're going to move on to smallpox. And this is wild. This outbreak, it started in 1901 and then just didn't want to die. It would die down, flare up, die down, flare up. Again, we'll go over some of the symptoms, similar to the flu, nausea, vomiting, chills, body aches, wildly high fever, 101, 102, and up. But the main thing with smallpox are the scabs, the lesions. And I've used Dr. Phillips's drawing here from the journal instead of any free use photos, because the photos of individuals with bad cases of smallpox are just, they're grotesque. So I figured a medical drawing would be a lot better. But basically you get these large boily sacs filled with fluid that then scab over and do horrible scarring to your body. Your eyes also hemorrhage. You blow all the blood vessels out of your eyes. That's what you see in the top drawing there. In the worst cases, if it's not treated, you can have absolute permanent blindness. So symptoms can occur 1 to 3 weeks after exposure. And of course, you're contagious during those 1 to 3 weeks. And then once you get symptoms, it could last 2 weeks up to even a month before it finally runs its course. It's just an absolutely nasty disease. But the interesting thing with smallpox is we have a vaccine. We have the first vaccine. Smallpox was the very first vaccine ever created by Jenner in 1796. He took cowpox, which is a less dangerous version, and tweaked it and put it into a vaccine for smallpox. So here we go. December 1901, it was about a week ago this month, you know, so it was right now we would be in the thick of the early stages of the smallpox epidemic if we were 119 years ago today. Patient 0 was in Plymouth again, but this one spread all throughout the valley and beyond at the end. The Scranton headline there is actually from the very end, from January 1903. Now this one, you saw a really proper shutdown. Churches closed, schools closed, Sunday schools closed, bars closed, theaters, people were out of work. I mean, this was a shutdown of all shutdowns. Because we had a vaccine, you had to get vaccinated. And you had to have a vaccination certificate, carry it with you, and you had to have a written doctor's note too, saying, you know, he didn't just forge this, this is a real thing, I'm his doctor, I performed the injection on whatever date. If you didn't have both of those on you, you couldn't go anywhere because they shut down all the ways across the river. They shut down the trolleys, they shut down the bridges, they shut down the ferries going back and forth. And interestingly enough, many sources talk about how you would actually, even if you had the paperwork, you would get on the trolley. As soon as you got on, a man would come and fumigate everybody. And then he would get off, and then you'd go to your stop, and before you could get off, another man would come on, fumigate everybody again, and then kick you off. And he sort of had those old school Looney Tunes, you know, pump can, and would just hose everybody down as he went. Because smallpox is just a nasty disease, and everybody is terrified of it, and justifiably so. Now, the cases for this were really high, and they were really widespread, but it wasn't the massive outbursts you see, especially later on with influenza. You see like 9 cases in one day. You see maybe 7 cases in one day. and it lingered across the better part of 3 years, 1 full year, and then parts of 2 other years. So it wasn't just a smash that we got for influenza. So that, coupled with the mass vaccination program, it kept the fatalities to a mere 48, at least that are reported and that can be proved anyway, which really is a miracle, because this was incredibly feared in the valley. And I mean, they shut everything down for a long period of time. But of course, anytime vaccines come into play, you have the other side of the coin. This ad right here started to show up in newspapers, not just in Pennsylvania, but all across the country, for the Anti-Vaccination Society of America in 1902. And they want you to join them. Write to Frankie Blue out in Terre Haute, Indiana, and he'll get you your certificate of membership for just $0.25. But you could see here that they use their own insults that were thrown at them against people. They're half-mad, misguided people. And, they believe it's suspect, and they want to keep their body pure as Mother Nature gave it to them. And that, their liberty cannot be taken. So you see basically all the same arguments you're seeing again today. They don't trust them. They don't know what they're being injected with. It's a choice. They shouldn't be forced to have to do this. They shouldn't be forced to have to carry around a certificate, yada, yada, yada. But even now, 117 years later, 118 years later, it's the same argument. It didn't start with Jenny McCarthy. Here we have a later vaccination certificate, but this is a smallpox vaccination certificate. This one's from 1931, but it is from Freeland. It is from Luzerne County. And this basically just says, yeah, you got injected, you're fine, you can go to different places. And we still have this today with kids for schools. It's a little bit different now because there's 80 million of them that you get vaccinated for now, as opposed to just one. But it's the same concept going forward today. We talked about some heavy stuff, and we're talking about some more heavy stuff, but I thought I'd break it up with a little levity here with some of these treatments that I found. This one on the left is wonderful. It was in the November 27th, 1850 Republican Farmer and Democratic Journal, which was a weekly newspaper in the Valley. And it's for scarlet fever, and it involves rubbing bacon all over the body of a person until their naked body is completely covered in fat. And that would relieve scarlet fever, according to the journal. Here is some remedies in a book we have in our library. Amanda found these for me. If you have diarrhea, take equal parts of laudanum. That'll cure what ails you and then some. You won't feel anything after that. And chill pills exist. You can make your own with this little simple recipe. You'll actually get 60 of them at the end if you do it right. And you'll take one pill 3 times every day, and you won't have a care in the world after that, I imagine, till you come crashing down. All right, so now the big one. Spanish influenza, 1918. If you notice, I put Spanish in quotation marks because I think we all know by now that it did not originate in Spain. It actually originated in Kansas with our own troops training for World War I. In case anybody doesn't know, the reason why it was called Spanish influenza was because Spain, being a neutral country during the war, they didn't have any censorship in their media. Every other country was censoring their media. Spain didn't. They were the only ones reporting on it for quite a while, so clearly it started in Spain. We didn't have anything to do with it. I don't think we need to go over the symptoms of influenza. I think we all know what they are. Just H1N1, which was the Spanish flu, was just a lot worse, and it attacked healthy people. Sort of the opposite of COVID. Generally, the younger you are, the fitter you are, the better chance you have to survive COVID, or the normal flu, which usually just infants and the elderly. Spanish flu was the total opposite. People my age were dropping like flies because it was just a very aggressive strain. So here you have an article. Now, this was October 29th. 25,000 deaths. That's across the state. That's not the county, but that's the state of Pennsylvania, Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, from October 1st to October 29th. So 28 days with 25,000 deaths. Basically 1,000 deaths per day in the state, as near as makes no difference. Wilkes-Barre Township, Georgetown was one of the areas that was really crushed, that we'll talk about in a little bit. So here's a picture in the newspaper of some of the nurses that were fighting. Nurses were pulled from all over. They were pulled out of their own hospitals. They were pulled out of nursing schools. Retired nurses were told to come back. and they really got a lot of the just desserts, publicity and praise that they deserved for this. White Hardware, on the other hand, which was a hardware store just off of Public Square, they ran this advertisement all through October of 1918 in a few different newspapers, and they figured that the Spanish influenza is a good way to get people to buy window ventilators. Fresh air is the greatest enemy of the dreaded influenza. This ad actually goes for quite a bit more. It's quite a bit longer. I had to crop it to fit, but it goes into prices, and they take payments, and somebody will come to your house and install it, and the whole 9 yards. So it's like the old mottage in business school: you don't sell a product, you sell fear. That's what White Hardware was doing. So now here's some data on the influenza outbreak in the county. Local historian Oscar Jewel Harvey, who wrote the History of Wilkes-Barre in Luzerne County, he actually wrote a book on influenza in Luzerne County, but he focuses on one particular outbreak, the worst outbreak, which was September 1918. He cites September 6th as the first day of the first case. He doesn't really back up why he cites that, but he claims September 6th was the first case. And then this outbreak sort of peters out in January of 1919. So it's a 5-month window, give or take. So September 6th, keep that in the back of your head. By the second week of October, in 5 weeks, 300 cases in Exeter, 400 cases in Glen Lyon, 200 in Wilkes-Barre, 400 in Wyoming. Kingston and Edwardsville weren't very bad yet. But that was when it was starting. That was only when it was beginning. November, we just get crushed to the point where we were averaging 75 new cases a day at least. Different places were making up the bulk of that. This is where you see Wilkes-Barre Township and Georgetown really get hammered. 35 cases a day, 40 cases a day. Kingston and Edwardsville and 44, they go through the roof. It's insanely widespread. So they get together and they form all of these committees that are nominally under the Department of Health. But what was interesting is World War I had rationing, of course. This is immediately after World War I. But a lot of it wasn't rationing in the way we think of it. A lot of it was rationing sort of peer pressure, sort of, community campaigns that were officially voluntary, but, your friends and neighbors were going to notice if you didn't take part, and that's pretty un-American and pretty unpatriotic. And so, of course, they had widespread participation. This was no different. This organization had no real legal power. They would issue mandates, but they couldn't really back them up. But people were listening to them. So they formed numerous committees. They had a canteen committee, which was involved in collecting and distributing food. They had an employment committee, which was involved in getting nurses from different places and reassigning individuals. They had a transportation committee to get doctors and nurses to where they had to go. They had my personal favorite, a borough cooperation committee, which was involved in getting all of our patriarchal little towns here to actually cooperate with one another. That one was headed by Percy Brown, the Percy Brown. He headed that committee and sort of became the figurehead, the face of this whole movement. And it worked. People bought into it. They did a few pretty radical things. They told the school board, because the schools were closed, they told the school board, hey, don't open up until we tell you to, which again, they couldn't really do, but they said, yeah, we're going to keep an eye on it. Don't open up till we say it's okay. They went to the teachers and said, hey, you guys aren't working. Why don't you come and do all this other work? Like, go to people's houses and take care of their kids or deliver food or do this. They basically just drafted the teachers and put them to work as laborers. They had ads in the newspaper. This is one of them looking for donations from butchers and grocers and various store owners for food to give out because they were running various canteens. But they put ads in the paper for homemakers. If you were a homemaker and you weren't sick, go to them and they would assign you a house that had a homemaker who was sick, and you could go and do her laundry or clean her house or help her kids. Basically, be a homemaker in another house. They pulled nurses out of nursing school and just said, yeah, your learning's done for now. You're going to go work for us now. They set up emergency hospitals all over. Plains had one, Wilkes-Barre had one, Georgetown had one. There was one in the Kingston Armory. They took nurses from hospitals, brought in the retired nurses, all that. In this 5-month period, just in the county, this isn't in the state, this is just in the county, we had 34,043 cases and 33,032 deaths, so about 10% fatality rate. And it left just under 2,400 children orphaned in the county. All of those nurses that were drafted, the second half of Harvey's book, he just lists all these statistics, and he lists pages and pages of nurses that were put to work in all these hospitals and everything, and their pay. And they range wildly. Some nurses made over $100. One lady only made 81 cents. I don't know if she only worked a week or what. He doesn't go into any detail. He just lists the numbers. But when you average it all out, they made $42. And that wasn't a week. That wasn't a month. That was $42 for that 5-month period, which is about $723 today with inflation. So, you know, you get pulled out of your job, you're working in one of these emergency hospitals, and you make about $700, and you get a thank you. Something to think about. So, you know, transitioning into Ally's part now, we have masks in 1918. You've probably seen this. There's a lot of articles. The New York Times did a big one. The Toronto Sun, we already talked about, did a big one. What about people wearing masks in 1918? Here's a shot. This is from New York City, people waiting to get a haircut. You know, it looks just like a barber shop today. Here, it's no different. It's just black and white, and they're dressed a little bit better. But interestingly enough, again, locally, it wasn't a law. It wasn't, you know, forced. Out west, it was much harder. You could be fined. You could be imprisoned. It was under law out west. And, you know, coincidence or not, they had much more resistance. Phoenix, Denver, San Francisco, Los Angeles, all these big cities, you see a lot of people being arrested for not wearing masks, usually under disturbing the peace. You see a lot of people protesting. There actually was an anti-mask League of America that was formed in San Francisco by a bunch of suffragettes, which I suppose is fitting in 2020. And they spread nationally, but they were primarily out west. East, again, it was all mandates. It was all peer pressure. It was all, this is what we're going to do. We won the war against the Kaiser. We need to win the war against the germs now. So I could never find anything really official locally talking about masks, except for in Harvey's book, he has this. And this was what Percy Brown's little organization put out. And this was how you would go about asking for aid. You'd actually have to go to them in person and say what you needed. And I won't read the whole thing, but it says this includes calls for doctors, nurses, aids, materials, and any other form of relief. So basically, whatever you needed, you had to go to them in person and ask for. And then at the very bottom, it says all attendants should wear masks. And I didn't add those stars. They were there right from the initial article. And again, it says should wear masks. It doesn't say you have to wear a mask or we're not going to help you. It doesn't say you're going to get fined. It doesn't say anything like that. It says all attendants should wear masks. And that's the closest thing I could find to an official government proclamation. And even that was from this extra governmental organization. They weren't even, you know, they were marginally under the PA Department of Health, but they pretty much were doing their own thing and were made up of local bigwigs. So that's pretty interesting. I thought. I know some of the design of masks is a little different. Some of it's a little bit the same. The materials, are, of course, are a bit different. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ally.
Hello. Yes. So to go off what Mark was saying, there were a bunch of emergency hospitals opening up throughout the area, starting on October 10th. And on October 11th, Wilkes-Barre Hospital actually started refusing to take any more patients because they didn't have enough nurses or space, and new cases were reaching about 100 a day in Wilkes-Barre alone. So more hospitals continued to open, but cases also increased to the point that on October 20th, 1918, the Commissioner of the Health of Pennsylvania issued to all concerned with the problems of nursing during the present epidemic of influenza, various recommendations for treating people and what to wear, including you should be covered completely, wash your hands repeatedly, and masks made of 8 layers of surgical gauze or 2 layers of butter cloth over a wire tea strainer molded to fit the face. And then secured by tape, and it should be changed every hour and boiled for half an hour and then dried in the sun. So, as you can see, these nurses are not wearing those masks. In fact, the style of masks worn by both nurses and non-medical professionals will vary drastically. These nurses here are creating masks and wearing a kind that didn't actually filter, but just diverted the breath downwards with, well, we know now, limited efficacy. If you could change the slide, Mark.
There you go.
Thank you. And here are 2 more nurses from Boston. One is wearing a sewn mask that's more fitted to the face, and another is wearing multiple layers of gauze just tied around her face. These masks are not mandatory, but they were encouraged and expected. Local newspapers routinely called out mask slackers for not wearing masks. So if you can do the next slide. Okay, this is actually from Canada. There were only a few publications throughout the country, the US, about how to make a mask. It seems that everyone just sort of knew. But this recommends a mask to be made by just a person, non-medical professional. Okay, so I have demonstrations.
All right, I'm going to stop the screen share here. Hang on. And I'm going to stop my video, or at least try to anyway. And the floor will be yours.
Can I go?
Yes, you can.
Okay, so first of all, this is 8 layers of gauze. It's not very thick and squishes down, but gauze itself is a very thin material. You can see the weave and very easily see through it. I know you can't really see it through the camera, but it's readily available at various fabric stores. So the Canadian publication recommended that you start with an 8x16 sheet of gauze and you fold it in half twice so that it is 4 layers of gauze. And then you tie it with 10-inch cord. I'm just using little ribbon to get this, which doesn't actually fit completely over the face. It does not fit over the chin. And it also doesn't seal around the face entirely. The sides end up just being little tunnels for the breath, and so does not filter, but diverts it again. So I couldn't make one of the ones recommended by the Commissioner of Health because I couldn't find a 4-inch tea strainer. But I did make one that's sort of more up to modern standards, but covered in gauze, so it looks old. Quilting cotton is very common, kind of cheap. It comes in various designs, but it is also has a dense enough weave to actually filter out, oh gosh, the virus. The virus is negatively charged, cotton is positively charged, so that's also exciting. So I took 2 layers of quilting cotton, layers of gauze, attached twill tape, and added some, not ruffles, these things, sort of like darts. This fits much better over the face, seals all the way around, and has the added benefit of filtering much better than just gauze. Um, it's not as effective as, say, one with a filter pocket, though, which would be much better because that includes polypropylene. But anyway, uh, any questions?
Yes, if you have any questions, feel free to send them to us in the chat. I was a little bit remiss. I need to give a shout out. This program is one, of course, it's part of an ongoing series. This is number 3, I believe. 2 or 3, I think 3. Yeah, 3. That is funded by grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities, as well as the Pennsylvania Council for the Humanities, as well as Luzerne County. We just got one of their CARES grants. You probably saw in the news. So without the 3 of those, none of this would be possible. It's also why it's going to be put on YouTube. The bulk of these grants, the point of them is to get our collection out, our programs out to the public in an epidemic, which of course we're under one now. So big thank you to the 3 of those. Thank you, Allie. That was very good. Thank you all for attending. If you, as I said, if you have any questions, feel free to send them over to the chat. It should go right to me if I have it set up correctly. We will be doing a little commercial coming up. We're going to be doing Anthracite Heritage Month next month with Bob Lewinsky. He puts that on every year. It's a wonderful collection of programs. We'll be one of the participating organizations in the program. We are going to do the other side of mining life, women and children. We have 2 of our former interns, one of whom was just hired by the Cumberland County Historical Society. They're going to talk about Ellen Webster Palmer and the Breaker Boys, and then the wives of anthracite miners. So that's going to be very interesting. And then in February, for African American History Month, our one board member, Constance Wynn, who is a member of the race team, is a former president of the local NAACP chapter. She is doing a talk on African American suffragettes and how the fight kept going much longer than 1920 for many African American women. So both of those are going to be part of this program, part of the grants. So look for them in January and February, respectively. Okay, we have a few questions here. Now, Allie, you can help me with this first one because I know you read a lot of the same sources I have. What hospitals were near miners' mills in 1918? I know Plains had an emergency hospital, Harvey talks about. Was there one in miners' mills specifically? I don't remember him
mentioning miners' mills specifically. The first one in Wanami was opened October 10th. So was one in Catawissa. Emergency hospital. Exeter on the 11th. That was the Hazleton, DuPont, Nanticoke. And then Plains.
Yeah, I think Plains would have been probably the closest one if you didn't go to General itself, but of course General stopped taking patients. General and Mercy both stopped taking patients in the crush of it. So probably the Plains Emergency Hospital would have been your best bet. Good question. Okay, Michael Dixon, do you have any information on how hard the epidemic hit the nurses and the doctors? Were there any fatalities to staff in the hospital? I did not notice any breakdowns by occupation through my research. I mean, they would if it was somebody specific, if like one person died on a day, which you saw a few times during the typhoid outbreaks, they might mention, John Smith was a bricklayer or something if he was the only one, but I didn't see any statistical breakdowns. Did you, Allie? I'm saying they don't exist. I just didn't come across them.
I know the Mutter Museum last year, the year before, they were doing a very large project related to sorting through data like that in Philadelphia. To graph who it affected and where and things like that. But I don't know if anybody's analyzed that in this area.
I mean, this is just pure speculation, wild mass guessing on my part, but I would say there would almost have to be, especially with the nurses, because I mean, they were pulling nurses from anywhere and everywhere to do triage and to do the day-to-day care And a lot of them, I mean, they all had training, but a lot of them weren't completely trained. A lot of them had been out of the game for a little while. And, you know, kudos to them all for doing it. These were all volunteers. These were all people who stepped up to the plate. But a lot of the, this is a poor choice of words, but a lot of the proper nurses were still overseas. So, you know, we had a lot of students, we had a lot of retirees, we had a lot of people that would work at the hospital and then get pulled out and go to the emergency hospital. I would almost guarantee there were quite a few amongst the ranks of the nurses, but I just don't have that data. I haven't come across that data, unfortunately, to give you a specific number. I would love to find out, because I'm sure it has to be staggering, because when you look at some of the numbers, I mean, you know, in a 5-month period, you had 34,000 cases. I mean, some of them had to have been frontline workers, especially with the masks Allie was just showing you. I mean, even on a little screen there, you can see they're not great. So I would bet there probably was a decent amount, but unfortunately, I just don't have, for all of his statistics, and you know, the whole second half of that book is nothing but numbers. He didn't go into the occupational breakdown, which is kind of interesting. Any other questions? I hope you all enjoyed it this evening. I famously said in the pitch meeting for this, however long ago, I don't know if it'll actually be a good lecture, but there's a lot of things that I personally find fascinating. And I think if we tell other people, they'll find it fascinating too. And it's staggering when you go through, especially newspapers.com, and you just read the daily paper and just how much we're repeating now. Old Vincent Cemetery in Plymouth had about 3,000 bodies moved in 1911 and 1912. Are there records of who was moved and where? There might be, actually. We have just on that shelf over off screen, I can't, my eyes aren't good, I can't read the titles of the books, but we have a collection of cemetery records and cemetery books. Give our librarian Amanda a shout. She would be able to tell you right off the top of her head pretty much if we have them, and if we don't, who to check with. Shoot her an email. Her email's easy enough to remember. It's just library@LuzeRneHistory.org. I know we do have a lot of cemetery transfer records. A lot of them are Wilkes-Barre City. They're not all the outlying areas, but it's worth a shot. The worst she could say is no. That's, you know, it's always good to ask. Oh, thank you, Mary. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Thank you for coming. Thank you all for coming. Spending your Friday night with us. I know there's way more interesting things to do on a Friday night than listen to Allie and I talk about, you know, sickness, especially when all you have to do to hear about that is just turn on the news. But you know, yes. But you know, if you're ever feeling depressed, which is very easy enough to do in these days, you know, we have been here before. It's hard. It's not good, but we will come out on the other end stronger. We always do. We have in the past. Oh, well, thank you, Jen. I appreciate that. So, yeah, that is all for us, I think, unless anyone else has any other questions. It's right under an hour. We didn't go over too bad. Well done, Allie. We were shooting for an hour. We're at 53 minutes, so not bad.
Not bad.
But happy holidays to everyone, and we're going to come out strong in 2021, and it's going to be a better year. It has to be. There's just statistically, it has to be.
Say that now because you said something, it won't.
No, it's math. It's simple math. It's the law of averages. All right. Well, if I click this, I think I'm going to boot everybody. Well, first, let's stop recording.